Grandmother's Heart, Chapter 1, The Secret Meeting. "I'll race you across the bridge," Jeremy called to his sister. "All right. Go!" she shouted back, and she was off like a streak of lightning. Jeremy had his arms full of things from the market, and he got off to a slow start. "That isn't fair," he called after his sister. "You had a head start." "Yes, but you're older," Damaris answered over her shoulder. By then she was a good 15 yards out in front. But Jeremy was gradually making up ground as he got his momentum going. Damaris came to the bridge and started over it. She was only halfway over when she heard her brother's foot come down on the bridge behind her. She put a bit more effort into her running. "Not fair!" Jeremy called again in mock anger. He reached the dip in the center of the stone bridge and put on a burst of speed. As he came down the other side, he looked for his sister, but she was out of sight. He knew that she would try to beat him to the house, since she had won the race across the bridge. As he ran off the bridge and raced up the narrow, winding road, there was a scream behind him. Someone jumped out from behind one of the young trees that grew on each side of the bridge. This scared him so bad that he dropped his bundle, leaping high into the air. When he had spun around, he saw Damaris doubled over with laughter. He dropped to the ground to try to catch his breath. "You scared me silly," he gasped. Damaris was panting too. "Yes, you did look silly, all right." "Oh, thank you very much." Then they both looked at each other and started giggling. "Come on, Damaris, help me pick up these things." The two children gathered up the packages of flour, sugar, and dried lima beans. Fortunately, none had spilled out. This time, Damaris carried the beans. "I hope Grandmother feels better this afternoon," said Damaris. "Me too," said Jeremy. Nearly at the end of that winding road, on the side of the hill, the children drew near a little house. It wasn't an ordinary house, however. It looked, well, edible. The outside was covered with what seemed to be rock-sized jelly beans, and the roof looked as if it were made of hundreds of hot cakes overlapping one another. It made one's mouth water just to look at it. There were no other houses on the hill. The only other buildings anywhere nearby was an old church. The church was on the same side of the hill, but further down, a little closer to the village. Jeremy and Damaris lived with Grandmother in the little house. She was old and kind and wore her long gray hair tied up neatly on the top of her head. Her small body was neither fat nor thin. She was one of those grandmothers who is seldom seen without her apron. Grandmother was much more delightful than ever her wonderful house. You might say that she was the grandest grandmother there ever had been. None had ever heard of a grandmother as wise and good as her, not in the village or in the town or even in all of the kingdom. As Jeremy followed Damaris into the house, he almost stepped in a bucket that he had left at the foot of the steps. "Whoa! Are you all right?" asked Damaris. "Yes, I forgot to put away the bucket and broom this morning when we were cleaning, though," said Jeremy. "Grandmother, we're home," he called from the doorway. "Good, children, good," she replied. In her voice they could sense the love that she had for them. It had been that way ever since the two of them had come to live with her. Now there's something you must understand about grandmothers before we can continue. To some, being a grandmother just means that a woman's children have gotten old enough to have children of their own. Some give their grandchildren anything they want, and they let them do as they please. Others simply won't bother with them. Neither is really wise or good, and certainly not grand. But there is something special about a real grandmother, something magic. Not the wizard or goblin or enchanted forest kind of magic. No, more like the magic of springtime and sunshine, like the magic of flowers and fairies and stories about things you've never seen, but even more real than the things we see every day. This grandmother, though, was certainly magic in all those bright and happy ways, and more. So much more that we could fill 1,000 pages with good things about her and still have not finished. So we'd better go on. It was not only Jeremy and Damaris that she was fond of, though. She considered all the children in the valley her grandchildren. Not that most of them didn't have grandmothers already. Most of them did, and many of them were very special grandmothers, too. The children all loved this grandmother dearly, though, just as she loved them. They would scramble up the side of the hill to her delightful house many a day after school and listen to her stories about the king. Sometimes they would help her bake pies or work in her garden. She taught them many things about how to treat others. She taught them that being unselfish is the most important part of being real, whether or not you are a grandmother. Grandmother shared herself with the children, and they shared with her as well. They always had adventures to tell her, and often they would bring her little presents they themselves had made. Even more than the stories she told them, or the food that they enjoyed so much, the children appreciated the wise advice she could give them in such simple words. Each time they set out for home, as the sun was about to set at the end of the day, they felt like princes and princesses, their heads full of knowledge, hearts full of love, and tummies full of food. Now the children were happy and content as long as they were with Grandmother on her hill. They came to think of it as her own. However, there was a war being waged in the kingdom. It had been going on for years, as long as many of the children could remember. The enemy was an adjoining kingdom called Turpitude, ruled by the very wicked King Pernicious. His aim was to take over Altura and its people. Many of the fathers would go away to be soldiers and be gone for months at a time. Some of them never came back at all. Of course, this made the children sad. It made Grandmother sad, too. So she would gather them about her and comfort them. She also told them what brave men their fathers were, and what an honor it was to serve a wise king. King Isidore was not only wise, he was also very good. He cared for his people. In the last years of the war, the king's army had dwindled. He had lost many soldiers, many because of wounds, others because they grew weary of the fighting and forgot how vicious and evil their enemy really was. They refused to return to their king. To these men the king sent messages saying, "Those who do not stand with me to defend Altura might as well stand against me." Many of the king's own subjects no longer honored him. Finally, he hired men from other lands to help fight the kingdom's battles. It seemed that selfishness and indifference was spreading like a deadly disease throughout the kingdom of Altura. This made it easy for corruption and wickedness to spring up in every town, every village, and every family. Hardly any home went unaffected. Things seemed nearly hopeless to the few in Altura who still cared. About the same time things started to go wrong in the kingdom, Grandmother began to be ill. At first, she seemed to get along fairly well, and no one really knew anything about her troubles. Even if they had, not many would have cared. Selfishness was spreading, and they all had problems of their own. The children knew she was ill, though, even though she never complained. Soon they began to talk about it among themselves. "It must be her eyes," Byron said. "They're almost always moist." Another boy, Judd, thought it might be her back as well because she seemed bent over a little more each day. She never told him exactly what the matter was, and she seemed intent on spending more time with them than ever. It wasn't long before Grandmother became too weak to venture down her hillside. She might have made it down to the village with some help, but she could not have made it home again. The children brought her everything she needed and told her all that went on in the valley. Sometimes when she heard the reports, her pain seemed to increase. Her eyes had a strange sadness about them, yet somehow she sparkled and bubbled for them, as always. The children loved her so much that they kept her house and garden just as perfectly as she always had, but they did worry about her. She continued to grow weaker and weaker. She seldom slept. Instead, she would lie on her plain wooden bed with eyes open, looking at nothing. Often, her lips would move silently, as if she were whispering to someone. When she noticed their presence, she would call the children to herself and summon strength to tell them more about the king. They continued to take care of her. They brought in what they could from her garden. They earned money in the valley to provide for the rest of her needs. After Grandmother had been ill for a long time, the children gradually began to see the cause. They came to understand that her heart was somehow linked, and of course they didn't know how, to the pulse and heartbeat of the kingdom. Every time one of the children began to act selfishly, like so many others in the kingdom, she came to the very door of death. A turn for the worst in the war affected her likewise. Her health improved sometimes, though, if she or one of the others could speak to that foolish child and change his mind. If the war suddenly took a turn and it looked as though the king might soon be victorious, she would be up and about doing amazingly better. Grandmother's life was joined inseparably to the life of the kingdom and the people. If Altura fell, she would die. After one particularly long siege of illness, in desperation the children called a meeting. They had never all been together at the same time, but they felt now that Grandmother's life was hanging by a thread. They spread the word to all the children of the valley. On the next moonless night, they would meet in the old church near Grandmother's tiny house. When the night of the secret meeting came, every child was there. Each child sat unusually still. Their hearts were heavy with sadness and a feeling of dread. All in deep thought, they knew why they were there. No one spoke. When he was sure that everyone had arrived, Jeremy stood. He was not the oldest or the strongest of the boys there, but everyone thought, except maybe Jeremy himself, that he was the wisest. Grandmother would have been proud of them if she had known about this. She had often reminded them about the qualities that were important and about the ones that were not. Because they were living with her, Jeremy and his sister Damaris had been by Grandmother's side more than any of the rest of them, and so they chose Jeremy to lead them. "I think we all know why we're here," he began. "Our grandmother's heart is broken. Some of us here have helped to break it, but I hope that is all behind us. She is very near death. Our purpose in this meeting tonight is to see if there's anything we can do to help her." Jeremy paused. "I've been talking with some of you these last few days, and there have been many suggestions about what should be done. We all seem to agree that the only thing that will really help Grandmother is a total victory for Altura in this terrible war. I don't think we really have much choice. There is only one road open to us. We must go to King Isidore as soldiers and do whatever he thinks is best. We are only children, and it may already be too late, but I think it is the only small hope that we have at this point, don't you?" The children immediately accepted the plan. Some of them were afraid, but they knew that they had just as much to fear if they did nothing as if they went along. All of them were prepared to do anything they could for Grandmother, so the plan went forward with grim resolve. "There is something else that needs to be decided," said Jeremy after the children had accepted the plan. "I imagine you all know by now who I am and how I came to be here. You know that my sister and I are from the land of turpitude and were captured by the mercenaries that raided our town. We were to be sold as slaves, but we managed to escape. Grandmother found us and took us in, and we have been with her ever since. The reason I'm reminding you of this is that I think you should choose someone else to lead you. I don't deserve to be the captain of this army. Though we love Altura as our own country, we come from the enemy's land. Almost anyone else here would be more deserving than I. I suggest that we decide who will lead us." For one long moment there was a strained silence. No one had really expected Jeremy to decline his position. The children nominated no others. Finally, Byron, who was probably the oldest of the children, stood slowly to his feet. "I, for one, think that there is no one among us who can lead us better than you, Jeremy." Byron's voice grew stronger. "Yes, we know who you are. We know that you're the Prince of Turpitude, King Pernicious' own son. We also have seen how much you love Grandmother. You're the only one among us who has anything to lose if Altura is victorious. Still, for her sake, you're ready to do battle against your own people. I think I can speak for all of us when I say that we will have no one to lead us besides you." A deafening shout arose from the rest of the children. It was evident that they had made their decision, and there was nothing Jeremy could do to change their minds. "Thank you," said Jeremy humbly. "I still don't think that I deserve this honor, but since you have chosen me, I will do my best. There is still hope that together we can turn the tide for Altura and for Grandmother too." With that, the children gave another hearty cheer. They were so loud that Jeremy had to try to quiet them down quickly in case Grandmother was still sleeping in her little house not far away. They had all been careful not to let her know what they were about to do. Jeremy had the feeling, though, that there wasn't anything he could keep from her for long. Nowadays, Damaris was always at her side. Grandmother still didn't sleep much, but they thought she was resting a little better than she had been. When all was quiet again at the meeting, Jeremy continued. "Judd," he called. Quickly, a small, dark-haired boy with bright blue eyes stood to his feet. "Judd, I appoint you runner. You are small and swift, and there is a message you must take to the king." Jeremy drew a piece of paper from inside his tunic and read the note to everyone. "We understand that a good many of your soldiers have deserted you, so we, the children of Grandmother's Hill, will come instead. We are 128 strong, and we will bring into your service whoever else will put their life on our side." A murmur of assent rolled through the room. Jeremy continued, "We will wait for our messenger to return with word from you before we take action." Jeremy signed the letter for all the children. He handed it to Judd and wished him a safe and speedy trip. Judd left with the message, and the children's meeting came to a close. There was not much to do but wait for Jeremy to return. Until then, they couldn't be sure what the king would ask of them. As they parted, and each one went to his own home on that dark night, they bid each other goodbye with a saying that has lasted in that land for generations: "Take Grandmother's heart as you go." The journey from Grandmother's Hill to the king's castle was a long one for anyone at any time. To Judd that night, the thought of the trip ahead seemed overwhelmingly lonely and difficult. "It's a good thing I'm starting out on a night as black as this," he thought as he started his downhill run from the old church. There were many shadows to hide in, not a soul would be able to see him if he was careful. In spite of his rapidly beating heart, he felt confident of that. Even so, he was sure that hiding from the people he knew would be harder than dodging the enemy later, especially the men of the valley who stayed up late each night to drink and gamble. Reaching the giant elm, he climbed a branch and pondered his situation for a time. The elm's branches had hidden him well many times before. He had to decide whether to go through the town and risk being seen, or to take an old deserted road that went around the edge of the valley. That would take him well out of his way. That road would mean wasting more than half the night. Some said that road held danger too, although no one really knew what kind. Sometimes he thought he could feel evil lurking there even in the daylight, and sure enough, on nights like this. Judd chose to go through the town even though being seen might mean a beating, or even worse, spending the whole night locked in his room. No, time was of the essence. He would use alleys and dark doorways to hide. He had learned many tricks trying to stay away from the worthless fellows who roamed the valley these days. After looking to see if anyone was coming, Judd jumped down from the lowest limb of the giant elm and ran the last few hundred yards to the first cottages of the village. He dodged around them, running in a bent-over fashion, ready to stop at any moment or change directions if he saw danger ahead. The alley came to a sudden end. Voices rang out as he looked out from behind an old shop. The lights of the pubs showed a number of men sitting on the side street. They were arguing and fighting as always. Judd could hear plenty of commotion inside the pub as well. He waited, knowing there was nothing he could do while the men sat there facing him. Suddenly there was a crash, a yell. The men all stumbled inside to see what had happened. Little Judd knew that if he didn't take this opportunity, he might have to stay hidden for hours in the alley. He darted out into the light, only to see one last man leaning against the tavern door, staring straight at him. It was his father. He, too, had been drinking. Judd froze. For a moment, panic gripped his heart. Then Judd thought perhaps his father, drunk as he was, hadn't recognized him. Just then, his booming voice rang out. "Come here, boy!" Judd hesitated, not knowing what to do. Grandmother's words flooded his mind. "Little ones, obey your parents always. Love them and respect them." Judd's thoughts churned on. "I have to get this message to the king," he thought. "All the kids are depending on me, and it could mean life or death for Grandmother." Finally, with much dismay, he decided that Grandmother would expect him to obey. Judd walked slowly toward his father, still afraid, but knowing that part of loving Grandmother meant doing what she would have wanted, in spite of his mission. The man stepped out to grab his son. As he did, there was another crash from inside the tavern. He turned toward the door, then glanced back impatiently at Judd. "You better get going, boy," he growled. Judd didn't need a second invitation. Judd ran and ran and ran, straight through the middle of the town, just as fast as he could. When he got to the edge of the town, he kept on running. His legs hurt unbearably, and his lungs felt like bursting, but he made himself go on, over the rolling hills and straight into the woods. The road through the valley went into the forest, and Judd managed to stay on it. Finally, totally exhausted, he did not see a fallen log in the road and tripped over it. His head came down hard on the ground, and for a long time he lay quite still.